It's a real honor to introduce today's speaker, not just because of his credentials, but because of the kind of person he is. Dr. Nicholas Miller is professor of church history at Andrews University at the Seminary. He's also a teacher of public affairs at Washington Adventist University in Tacoma Park, Maryland. He's a religious liberty attorney who has spent decades standing in the sacred space where faith meets public life. He's argued religious liberty cases at the highest level and helped shape Adventist thought on prophecy and politics, contributing to the Hope Channel series Liberty and Justice for All. He also recently teamed up with Pastor Dwight Nelson, who just a few months ago, many of you remember, spoke on these topics from this pulpit. But in addition to all of the heavy intellectual lifting that he does, Professor Miller is also an avid sportsman. And he is from this area originally, so he's a surfer. Not only that, when we were at the seminary, he would frequently be with us on the basketball court 6 a.m. at Ruth Murdoch Elementary School. He'd be playing with us future pastors. And now we have both come to the light of pickleball, and we endearingly call him the Lob Father. And since his time of being here, we have already had the opportunity to play a few times, which has really fed me. And so I've been blessed by our friendship, his mentorship, and his leadership in our church. I know that we will all be richly blessed by his presentation. And there will be time for a question and answer. So as questions come, please do take note of them, and then we'll have roving mics go around. But without further ado, I want to invite up Professor Nicholas Miller to join us.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. Well, it's always a blessing to see former students out in the real world blessing other people and doing well in the church and in church leadership. And I had the privilege of being at the seminary when both Tara and Daniel were there, and it's great to see them providing leadership in this wonderful church. I was never a member of Azure Hills Church. This was never my home church, but in some ways it was a bit of a home for me from time to time in the summer. I appreciate Daniel's a recognition of the fun times I've had with my students. And it is nice to be with your students outside the classroom, whether it be teaching them surfing or playing basketball or pickleball. It's where you learn about the real people behind the facade sometimes that's up front. And so that's been a blessing to me. But I suppose in some ways, that's one of the things that this church here helped teach me. You have a very nice facility and campus here. I don't know if you still have the swimming pool or not, but you used to many years ago. And I think it was when I was about 6 or 7 or 8, this is where I came for summer camp. One day there were no kids in the neighborhood to play with anymore, and my mother made some inquiries and discovered that some of them were coming here for the summer camp. And so this was one of the early and first places that I learned to associate spirituality with fun outdoor activities and games and connecting with other people in that context. And I understand that ministry in some form continues here. And it certainly was a blessing in my life, and I thank you for it and urge you on as you continue to do that. So I left Loma Linda perhaps many years ago, more than I want to mention. It's more than the 30th anniversary of me becoming an Adventist as a teenager. And went to PUC, got a law degree. No, not a law degree. I had a theology degree and was a pre-law student. And then went on to law school in New York City. But while I was at PUC, developed an interest in church and state and religious liberty, and went on to law school specifically to study that further. And over the years, the Lord gave me experiences in working for the government in D.C., defending public officials, especially from constitutional claims. So I learned about the Constitution and how it operates as a practical matter. I then worked for private firms that specialized in representing religious institutions, religious colleges and hospitals, churches. And then eventually I realized, man, I wish I knew more about the history of church and state, right? I had a theology degree and I had a law degree, but I didn't really have much of a church history background. And Providence opened the doors, and Andrews University approached me about sponsoring me for a PhD in religious and legal history if I would come there and open up a church-state study program and center and teach in their church history department. So I did that, which is a bit of a sacrifice for a Southern California native. I'm not quite a native. I was born in England, but grew up here from the age of 3. So to move from sunny Southern California to wintry Berrien Springs, I must say I was a little bit envious of my students, right? They only had to come for 2 or 3 years, and then they could get shipped off to places like Azure Hills Church. And there I stayed, laboring in the Lord's Siberian vineyard for nearly 18 years. About 3 years ago, I got a call from some of the leadership at Washington Adventist University, and they were looking for someone to help lead their Center for Law and Public Policy. And given my legal background and my previous experiences in Washington, I saw the Lord's leading in this. And also the weather's a little more mild in Maryland, which didn't hurt. And so for the last 3 years, my wife and I have lived in Maryland, about 10 minutes from the General Conference headquarters, and I've taught half-time at Washington Adventist University and continued my legal practice in representing religious institutions in the church and working with public policy issues on Capitol Hill. And part of what I do at WAU, we've raised some funds to have students work as fellows, and they connect with church leaders who are doing public policy issues, like ADRA. ADRA works in the public policy arena. Liberty Magazine, the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department, Adventist Healthcare. So our students team up with these various organizations, and we work with them to help sort of create a new generation of Adventists that can even more intelligently and thoughtfully help translate Adventist principles, biblical principles of not just religious liberty, but other questions of how the church should think about complicated issues of public policy. How do we bring our consciences and our biblically informed perspectives to bear? And I think for too long in the church, we've taken the position that the only thing to think about as Adventists is the separation of church and state. Like, we shouldn't think about politics. We should only think about preserving our religious freedom. But it was of great interest to me as a church historian that I discovered our pioneers didn't just do that. They were actually involved in affirmative public policy measures, including opposition to slavery, right? Which on its face isn't about Sabbath and Sunday or even religious liberty, but a fundamental civil rights issue. And they were involved in petition drives and law movements and actual civil disobedience, right? Some people question whether, should a Christian be involved in a protest of any kind? And actually protesting, peaceful protesting, is one of our fundamental First Amendment rights, right? It's protected in the Constitution. Civil disobedience goes beyond mere protest. And yet our prophet herself was the one who urged and said civil disobedience must take place if there were unjust laws, such as the fugitive slave law. Later on, there were movements to pass laws forbidding the use and sale of alcohol, which again isn't on its face a religious liberty question. It's dealing with Sabbath and Sunday. And so I've often wondered, what happened in our church that made Adventists quiet about almost any public policy issue except the possibility of coming Sunday laws, right? We would bear almost anything in the news that had to do with the government and laws, but we would scour the bottoms of the internet to see if there was a Sunday law pending somewhere in Congress. And it struck me that we had lost the biblical perspectives of our pioneers on perhaps a broader vision of what the Lord was calling our church to witness to in these last days of Earth's history. And that sort of brings me to my present topic today, as we've thought a little more broadly about how the biblical Adventist prophetic message might impact how we think about some of the rather dramatic political movements and changes that have taken place over the last few years, and maybe especially over the last year. My comments are going to fall into three categories, and they've given me a whole hour here, which is a little bit crazy. That's like twice as long as a sermon, and I'm not nearly as interesting as Pastor Tara or Daniel, and I've got to fill almost twice as much time. So I'm going to require some input from all of you from time to time. And there's going to be three main sections I'm going to talk about. I'm going to touch on something that has inspired me to be vocal about this, is my study of church history, and especially Adventist church history, during other times of crisis, most notably during World War II in Europe, right? And if you study that history, you will leave it with a sense of some disappointment. You know, we are a church that purports to have a message which says, there's a time of crisis coming on our world, and we have a message for you that will help you make the best kinds of choices, personally and as a community, during that time of moral crisis. Well, that final time of crisis hasn't come yet, but we've had other kinds of crises, haven't we? And if we look and see how we reacted during those, we may understand why God hasn't brought the final time of crisis, because it doesn't look like we were quite ready under some other circumstances. And those of you who are familiar with the Adventist Church during World War II, at least in Germany, we did not cover ourselves with glory. You may have heard of the Confessing Church and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the people that stood up for the Jews and for the gospel, and you would hope that we would find Adventist leaders and workers as part of that movement. But so far, I haven't really been able to find any. Now, there are some names, a few people that did stand up. There's Eric Widener, his book, The Seventh Escape. There's the Hazel family. And individually, they did some things, right? So we don't want to just say nobody did anything. But as a whole, as an institution, not only did I wish we had stayed silent in some ways, because silence would have been better than actually supporting some of the things that were happening and speaking well of Adolf Hitler because he was a vegetarian and didn't drink alcohol and upheld certain family values, although not other family values as we know. So now, I'm not speaking out of turn here, telling secrets that aren't known. I think it was about 15 years ago, on either the 50th or 60th anniversary of the end of World War II, that the churches in Germany and Austria issued an apology for their behavior and their lack of protecting their Jewish members. In fact, they had to apologize for not just not protecting them, but from actually turning them over when the government came and said, we want the Jews among you. So it's good that we apologized, but it would be better if we learned the lessons and avoided having to apologize in the future. Wouldn't you agree? So it is that experience and that study from history that has perhaps made me a little bit more vocal than some of my peers and colleagues in the church in willingness to speak out on public policy issues. And I'm not suggesting here that we're in Nazi Germany or that we have Hitlers amongst us, but I think that the lesson is that we need to speak up not when somebody becomes Hitler, but at the earlier stages, when principles are being violated, when people are being marginalized in ways that begins the road to more severe consequences. The second thing I want to talk about are two Adventist prophecies that I think have profound modern relevance. I think in the advertisements it's talked about Revelation 13. Hopefully many of you are familiar with the beast with lamb-like horns that speaks as a dragon. Probably most of you know about that prophecy. We talk about it in our evangelistic campaigns. And most of us think about it as being a prophecy to do with a past and a present where America is a lamb-like beast, and a future when it will speak as a dragon. But much to my interest, our pioneers didn't view it that way. They viewed it as something that was happening at the same time, even while they were alive. That there was a lamb-like beast that had high ideals and high aspirations, but that even then it was violating those in some profound ways, and in their instance, it was especially violating it in the instance of slavery, right? That it was a country that held up liberty and freedom and equality, but it was enslaving a whole group of people based on their race. And it would then even speak more fiercely as a dragon in the future, where it began to violate other sorts of principles as well. But for the last 50 to 100 years, we've tended to say, lamb-like now, Christ-like now, at some point in the future, it will speak as a dragon, and then we'll need to stand up and say something. But until then, we can be patriotic, flag-waving Americans and don't really have anything to say about what our government is doing. But watch out for those Sunday laws, right? And that's what we're concerned with. But if we, again, understand our pioneers a little more broadly, we may see beyond that. The third issue that I want to talk about is that of the scapegoat. Scapegoat. Now, some of you, those of you who studied your Old Testament Bible will know the scapegoat in the Bible is the goat that's let loose in the wilderness, right, on the Day of Atonement. There's one that's killed in the temple, the other is sent into the wilderness to die, and we've taught generally that that scapegoat is representing Satan and the sins of the people. The sins that Satan has tempted the people to commit are put on him, and off he goes to die. But scapegoat has come to mean something else in our culture, in the West, and it's come to mean, in fact, almost the opposite of that. Not the evil, great arch-tempter who dies because of all the sins that he has caused, but it's come to mean a goat, an individual that's innocent, that is blamed unfairly for the sins, for the wrongdoing, for the evils that are in the community. And we as Adventists have thought in terms of that being part of the last day events, right? That there will be great catastrophes and natural disasters, and there will be then a finger pointed at a certain faithful group of remnant people who are doing what? Having the faith of Jesus and keeping the commandments of God, most clearly seen in their keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, right? And they are going to be persecuted for this. This is classic scapegoatism, right? Do they deserve to be persecuted? No, they're being faithful to God, and yet they are being scapegoated, and it's not fair, and then God comes to save them in the end. So that's a very clear part of our last day theology, but we seem less capable of seeing the problem of scapegoatism when we are not involved and when the Sabbath isn't involved. Are other people or other marginal groups not ever scapegoated? And in fact, if you look at human history, you'll discover there's a whole cycle of scapegoating that seems to happen in every culture and in every time and place. And I think it's happening again more severely in our country. And I want to show how this, because to me, as I've begun to understand this, this connects to the heart of the gospel, to what Jesus did on the cross, and how he expects us to respond both to him and to other people who are being scapegoated. And this came to me not long ago, a couple of months ago, maybe 3 months ago, during Easter this year. Now, I'm going to begin actually by talking about this scapegoating issue and how it may relate to current events, because it's I think, the gospel entry into this topic that then I will move on into the prophetic part of it. And sometimes I think we separate these two things out, and I think prophecy and the gospel are meant to go hand in hand. Let me share these reflections with you, and I'll begin talking about Germany because I think it's relevant in this context. A historian of 1930s Germany wrote of the dark paradox of the celebration of Easter in that ostensibly Christian country. It was a time when German Lutherans, remember Germany had a state church, it was the Lutheran church, they went to remember and reflect on the mistreatment, persecution, and execution of a first-century Jew, while all around them, 20th century Jews were being mistreated, persecuted, and also eventually executed. While they gathered and sang hymns, meditated on, and celebrated the first century Jew, most of them had little to nothing to say about the Jews being persecuted around them, either quietly accepting it or even, sadly, endorsing it. I'm wondering if we are experiencing a similar phenomenon today. The story of Christ involves the false arrest, illegal imprisonment, undeserved beating, and unjust trial and execution of the most innocent man in history. Principles of both Jewish and Roman law were violated by an illegal arrest at night, a hasty trial held in darkness, a lack of arraignment, and the use of false and conflicting testimony. Pilate was so aware of the problems of executing an innocent man that he publicly washed his hands of the whole event. Now, this year on Easter weekend, when modern American Christians are reflecting on these events, many of them, if not most of them, have not much to say about the mistaken or unprovoked arrest, unconstitutional deportation, and illegal imprisonment in foreign concentration camps of not just one of my neighbors in Maryland, but hundreds of other migrants. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, maybe most of you, that the difference between these two stories is that Jesus was innocent, but all of these migrants are guilty of at least unlawful entry into the United States, and some of them worse kinds of law-breaking. But here's where the comparison with the Christ story becomes really interesting and potentially disturbing. French philosopher René Girard, he was the one that brought to my mind the crucifixion of Christ, how it unmasks and reveals the bankruptcy of the historical use of the scapegoat principle. And he notes that this is a phenomenon that is found throughout history and throughout societies, as societies need to keep their unity together to find a small group to blame for problems that they face. And it has to do with fundamental human greed. We all want more of the pie than we need, and some of us get it more than we need, and these days we've seen billionaires rise and the billionaire class rise at the expense of the middle class. When I grew up here in the 1970s, America was one of the most egalitarian nations in the world, with a huge middle class and a small gap between the top wage earners and the bottom. Since that time, since the 1990s, I think I'm becoming unmoored here a bit. America, the gap between rich and poor has become markedly different, so that we are now reflecting more the gap that existed in the Gilded Age and the gaps that exist in Central and South American countries, where there's a small elite that controls the vast number of resources and a much smaller middle class. And what happens is the leadership class has all the resources, there's pain and suffering and difficulty. The leadership class wants to maintain its position, and it finds minority groups, outsiders, to blame for the problems that exist. And these outsiders, blaming these minority groups, takes the attention of the population away from the billionaires and the wealthy and focuses them on these outsiders, and it unites, at least temporarily, the groups in the middle. It draws the majority together in greater unity and diverts their attention and keeps a relative level of domestic peace and tranquility. Of course, this peace comes at the expense of the health, safety, and at times even lives of the scapegoated group. So there's examples of this throughout history. Jews in Germany, Tutsis in Rwanda, the victims of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Africans played this role in our history, in slavery and Jim Crow. Jews, of course, have often played this role in the centuries since Christ's death. Alleged witches in the Middle Ages, victims of the Crusades and the Inquisition, It goes on and on and on. And Girard argued that the death of Christ shows the bankruptcy of the scapegoat principle, because everyone acknowledges that Christ was innocent, right? And yet he is singled out and mistreated. So we can see through Christ's experience the tendency of society to do this, and that we can see that the scapegoating principle is a fault and evil of the majoritarian society rather than actually being justified by the faults of the targeted victims. Now, given human fallenness and cupidity, there's always an argument that some person or group of people are guilty of something and deserve their fate. So again, what I just mentioned earlier with the migrants, the undocumented migrants. Well, they came into the country without proper documentation. But does that deserve kidnapping on the streets, being held in detention without access to your family or lawyers, and removal in the middle of the night to concentration camps in a country that is completely disconnected from the country of your birth? Right? That's called disproportionality. That is not, most people don't realize that being unlawful documented status is not actually a crime. You cannot be imprisoned for it. You can be detained for it, and then you can be removed from the country to the country that you came from, but it is not a crime. Now, if you come back again, there's ways you can make it a crime, but most Americans don't realize this. We don't even know, actually, if they all came in, the ones that we deported to El Salvador, if they came in unlawfully or not, because there weren't hearings given, which is a fundamental concept to protect any American, right? If they're not giving hearings, then you could have green card, you could be a citizen, and you don't find out till you're out of the country. So in reality, we know that a number of them had no criminal records in any country, and at least one, my neighbor from Maryland, Abrego Garcia, was in lawful status under court order that forbade him from being deported. Even if all the deportees to El Salvador were in undocumented status, which you know is not the case, we do know there was no basis in American civil, criminal, or constitutional law to arrest them and send them to concentration camps in a foreign country. They are like the classic scapegoats of human history, flawed, imperfect, fallible, yet not much different from the rest of us who may have had a speeding violation, been late on our taxes, or forgotten to change our driver's license when we moved to a new state. Should there be penalties for these offenses, sometimes even willful acts? Sure, and I've paid my share of speeding tickets, but none of this would justify my late-night abduction, transfer across the country, and placement in the most notorious concentration camps in the Western Hemisphere. So why is that acceptable for this to happen to our migrant neighbors? And I think the short answer is because they have become scapegoats used by certain political leaders to consolidate political support, unify their base, and keep power for themselves. And I have to say that this is just the kind of story that Christ's story is meant to unmask. That if we understand at least part of the message of Easter, of what happened to Christ, is that we are meant to say something when this kind of thing happens. Christians of all people should see this scapegoating for what it is, a satanic strategy to lay the blame for the world's evil at the door of someone else, anyone else, especially a marginal, defenseless else, that will shield the rest of us from dealing with our own failings, shortcomings, and personal and systemic problems. On Easter weekend and on Sabbath since then, we should see the faces of Abrego Garcia and his imprisoned migrant friends, as fallible and imperfect as they are, dimly but clearly reflected the face of the one who was truly just and innocent, and yet treated with a similar injustice and severity as they are being treated. in closing our ears to calls for justice and due process for them, are we not showing how we would react to calls for justice and fairness for Christ? Are we showing who we would be shouting for when Pilate gave the Jews the choice to free either Christ or Barabbas? Barabbas being a Jewish zealot given to extremism and violence to restore the greatness of the Jewish nation. Sadly, we can hear the call of many Christians today, not on behalf of the only mildly non-innocent among us, but on behalf of those seeking to restore a mythical Western European Christian American heritage at the expense of those whose diversity has made America a truly great country. And here we come into the other part of my theme in terms of Christian nationalism. Much of what is being done is being carried out in the name of an approach to religion that wants to prioritize Western Christian religion and make it the sort of official center of who we are as a nation and who we are as a people. There are some, like Peter, who do not call for a crucifixion, but who, at our times of crisis, out of fear or self-preservation or desire for popularity, do not raise their voices in defense of the innocent, but rather deny knowing about them. Let the government do its job. Surely they are only arresting and deporting guilty people. We don't know what them. Why should we second guess? Hopefully, like Peter, they will come to their senses, see their denial of Christ's true message, and become convicted of their shortcomings and speak out on behalf of the truth and the persecuted. But how much better to approach Easter morning with a conscience clear, because we have done what we can to speak on behalf of the abused, marginalized, and mistreated. One whose experience shows us the wrongness of blaming and misusing others for our own sins and shortcomings. Because he is risen, we can speak on behalf of those that especially need a resurrection. Now, there is something that was said during the trial of Christ, or actually prior to Christ being arrested, but was remembered at the trial of Christ, that really shows the scapegoat principle being articulated very clearly. Do you remember when Caiaphas, the high priest, says this as they are discussing the danger that Christ presents to the nation of Israel? He says this in John 11, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." John remembers this later on when he's talking about the trial of Christ. In 7 chapters later, in John 18, he says that he reminds us that the first official who Christ comes before is Annas, who is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who is the one, quote, that advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for a nation. Notice that use of the word expedient there. It's not that it would be fair or just or righteous. It's that it would be of utility, right? We're weighing and balancing. Oh, well, he may be a righteous man or he may be innocent, but it's better that he would die than our nation, our precious nation, would suffer harm or have a threat to its existence. I was reminded of this statement during the last few months when our president made the remarkable claim that, quote, "He who saves his country does not violate any law," right? Which actually, to be fair, at its core, there is some truth to this, right? The ultimate aim of all laws is to preserve the peace and security of the nation. Lincoln famously suspended the writ of habeas corpus and spent money that hadn't been given to him by the Congress because he needed it for the Civil War when Congress was out of session. And yet, people telling that story often fail to tell the fact that when Congress came back into session, Lincoln wrote up an explanation of what he'd done and why he'd done it, and that it was necessary for the safety of the nation, and Congress ratified what he had done, right? Which is very different than saying, "I am the law and anything I do in behalf of the nation is therefore justified." which was a quote that was originally attributed to Napoleon, the dictator of France for many years. Now, we don't know if he actually said it, but he acted in a way as if he had said it, and there were people that attributed it to around him. So to seize that quote and say this is the way that the executive branch is now going to operate is truly a remarkable shift in the way that we think about the fundamental principles of our government. And here is where I want to pivot to prophecy. And I have a couple of quotes that I'm going to ask to be passed out. Oh, they're already passed out. Okay, very good. And the first has to do with Revelation 13 and how we've thought about America for 150 years. There's a nation that arises out of the ground at the end of near the time of the end, which is 1798, right? I don't have time to do a whole primer on prophecy, so I'm going to use some shorthand here. And this nation was early identified by our pioneers as the United States of America, not arising in the highly and densely populated parts of Europe, but here in the United States, and there were native peoples here, and we mistreated them badly, and so on and so forth, so we're not saying that this was somehow justified, but it does historically describe the different kind of origins that we had as a nation, and that everything associated in the book of Revelation with the Lamb is connected with the Christ-like figure, right? The Lamb of God who uses power in a fair and equitable way. And early on, and we have this quote here where Ellen White talks about this beast, saying, "The lamb-like horns indicate youth, innocence, and gentleness, fitly representing the character of the United States when presented to the prophet as coming up in 1798. And I'm going to jump down a few lines to, it talks about the Declaration of Independence, all men being created equal with an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Constitution guarantees to the people the right of self-government, providing that representatives elected by the popular vote shall enact and administer the laws. Freedom of religious faith was also granted, every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. Republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of the nation. These principles are the secret of its power and prosperity." Right? So she identifies two principles. And if you look at the parallels set out above, republicanism, not to be confused with the Republican Party, but to be viewed as a form of government that both the Democratic and Republican Party, in theory, are supportive of, right? Republicanism is a form of democracy where people elect their representatives. I think it's most aptly described by Abraham Lincoln, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, right? So it's a government elected by the people, but that's not enough, because you could elect a dictator, which Germany did in the 1930s. So it's a government elected by the people that is run by the people and is carried out for the people. And this is guaranteed by something we call the rule of law, that the decisions aren't made based on loyalty to particular individuals. We don't have like a tribal system where the chieftain gets to say what's right and wrong. There's a system of laws and judges which adjudicate. There's a separation of powers. There's a checks and balances. All those things you learned about in civics and American history class are encapsulated in this phrase, republicanism. And then Protestantism, she's identifying with the basic fundamental principle of conscience, of religious freedom, of free exercise of religion, of the separation of church and state, right? And she briefly sets those points out here. Now, many Adventists, especially in the last 50 to 100 years, focus almost entirely on the one horn of religious freedom. And even there, they want to kind of narrow it down to, are there Sunday laws in Congress, right? It's the Sunday Sabbath principle. But set out here, it's much broader than that. And in fact, it is that breadth that caused our pioneers to be involved in anti-slavery and temperance reform. And even when slavery was over, people like A.T. Jones and Wagner and the Liberty Sentinel continued this critique of American actions during the Spanish-American War. You may remember that involved places like Guam and Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And A.T. Jones and others wrote in our papers that this war violated the principles, not of necessarily the religious freedom horn, but of the republicanism horn, because these wars were undertaken based on religious identity. These nations were largely Catholic. On ethnic identity, these nations were largely Hispanic and brown, that there was a Anglo-Saxon supremacy. Have you heard claims of white supremacy today? Well, our pioneers used the term Anglo-Saxon supremacy, and they criticized it and said it was in part what was driving American foreign policy. So in our publications, we spoke out consistently against and about these things because of our broader understanding of prophecy. Now, there is also then the speaking as a dragon bit, which again, as I said earlier, isn't just in the future. The future is a culmination of America speaking as a dragon. The present and the past is it doing it in small bits and pieces. And for early Adventists, part of being faithful American citizens was critiquing our country when it was falling short of its ideals. And that's why we published in papers the things we did about what we viewed as the abuses of government. I want to lay over this principle of Republicanism and Protestantism then one further insight from the book of Daniel, which has been very important to me over the last couple of decades. You may have heard of the kings of the north and the south. And we used to fight about this 120 years ago in the church, like what was the king of the north and the south? And the fight goes on in some circles, but for most of us who are doing the work of the church in the public square, in the religious liberty field, it's no longer a debate. Like, we're pretty clear. It's guided our work for 2 or 3 decades at this point. And actually, there's not really dispute about the king of the north, right? And just I want to leave some time for questions and answers, so just a really quick primer. In the early parts of the book of Daniel, the king of the north and south are those nations associated geographically with Israel, right? So to the south of Israel is the nation of Egypt. And Egypt represents a certain kind of ideology. And to the north of Israel, well, it kind of shifted over time because the nations would come over the Fertile Crescent from the northwest and the northeast. So for a period of time, it may be Babylon, and it may be Medo-Persia, and then Greece, and then finally it's Rome. And then at the time of Christ's death, the northern power, we see quite easily pagan Rome becomes papal Rome, which assumes its kind of identity, and it continues on being a combination of church and state. And so perhaps for too long we focused on, it's the Catholic Church, when the reality is it represents any power that combines church and state and tries to use civil force to implement spiritual truths, teachings, and ideals, right? So that could be the Catholic Church at certain points in history, but it could be other churches at other points in history. But there's a general agreement that this king of the north is this religious, absolutist, coercive mixture of religion and civil power and authority. It's been the king of the south where there's been some conflicting views, and some people want to say it's Islam, but I think the best view, and the view that fits in certainly with this quote from the Spirit of Prophecy, and it's a lengthy quote, and I won't read the entire thing, but it's talking about Revelation 11. You remember the 2 witnesses that witnessed for 1,260 days in sackcloth and ashes? And these witnesses are the testaments, the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they're in sackcloth and ashes because the Bible isn't readily available during this time. And then during the French Revolution, the Bible is actually outlawed and burned, and so these are the witnesses that lie in the streets of where? Sodom and Egypt. And Egypt, again, being the king of the south. But here we have its symbolic meaning, right? And Ellen White sets this out. The great city in whose streets the witnesses are slain and where their dead bodies lie is spiritually Egypt. Of all the nations presented in Bible history, Egypt most boldly denied the existence of the living God and resisted his commands. No monarch ever ventured upon more open and high-handed rebellion against the authority of heaven than did the king of Egypt. When the message was brought him by Moses, in the name of the Lord, Pharaoh proudly answered, "Who is Jehovah that I should hearken unto his voice to let Israel go? I know not Jehovah, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Studying this in our Sabbath school lesson recently, I think, haven't we? This is atheism, and the nation represented by Egypt would give voice to a similar denial of the claims of the living God and would manifest a like spirit of unbelief and defiance. And then she goes on to talk about Sodom and the meaning of that. And it's very interesting that historians recognize that kind of the beginnings of modern civic materialism really lie in the French Revolution. And I was just reading a Pulitzer Prize-winning book with my dad this week called To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, which is a story about the dissidents in Russia under the Soviet Union. And this was a toast that they would make every year at their gatherings to the hope, to the success of our hopeless cause, which actually isn't a bad toast for Adventists to make in some ways, because from a human perspective, right, we actually believe in kind of a short-term defeat, although there's an ultimate glorious, just like Christ went to the cross. And anyway, I won't belabor that point, but in reading that book, I was amazed and interested in light of this prophecy to hear this author saying that one of the dissidents said that all Russian school children are raised understanding that the foundations of their political system lay in important ways in the French Revolution, right? That this is like common knowledge among Russians and Russian young people. So the king of the South, in my mind, and in what Ellen White is setting out here, becomes the secularist forces of our modern world, most clearly seen and implemented in communism. And if you read the end of the Daniel 11, you will see that at the time of the end, the king of the South pushes against the king of the North. And this is about 1798, where the French Revolution, we then have Darwinism and evolution and materialism and atheism, and the elite culture of the West becomes largely agnostic, if not atheistic, right? And it pushes against. And that has been the story of the 19th and 20th century in America, in the elite parts of our society, the media, the press, so on and so forth, the higher education. But it says the king of the North pushes back and overflows and floods, and the final events in crisis then are brought by who? The king of the South or the king of the North? And really, if you want to understand Adventist prophecy, while we can't team up with the king of the South, and there are problems with skeptical, secular, left-wing wokeism that we could go into, that the bigger danger in the end is the reaction or the overreaction to that, which empowers an absolutist Christian, ostensibly nationalism that's going to use civil forces and powers to achieve its results. The significance, I think, of this we can see in, some of you may have heard of Project 2025. There's a nearly 1,000-page document that talks about the restructuring of American government in line with a Christian biblical worldview. And for those of you who are wanting to hear about Sunday laws, well, actually, for the first time, significant leaders in the evangelical world began talking about, in favorable terms, the history of our country and Sunday laws. And it's just a small section, and I don't want to overplay it, because they do speak favorably, how in the past we used to have these laws which preserved Sunday and Sunday sacredness for everyone. And what they're proposing is the passage of laws that will penalize employers for workers working on Sunday. It doesn't prevent it, but if somebody works on Sunday, you have to give them time and a half or double time. And for full disclosure, they actually kind of try to create an egalitarian approach to it. So if your sacred day is Saturday, they will allow that to be the day that you get paid the extra time and money for. Now, it's interesting because it doesn't actually protect people in the keeping of either their Sunday or their Sabbath, right? It just says you have to pay more for it, which isn't really a solution for Adventists. So in one fell swoop, it doesn't actually protect Sabbath and Sunday. But on the other hand, what it does is, for the first time that I'm aware of, it puts a government penalty in place based on a spiritual, religious teaching and outlook, right? And even though it doesn't force anyone not to worship or not to go to church or to go to church in ways that we think about when we're talking about Sunday laws, there's an important principle here that is being intruded upon, that the government should not pass or legislate based on purely spiritual points of view. Now, you may be confused. Earlier, I talked about the importance of Christians standing up for moral principles like slavery and temperance reform. But let's think about this for a moment. We have 10 commandments that are on 2 tables, right? And why does it have 2 tables? And the quick answer is, well, the first table is what we owe to God, and the second table is what we owe to humanity. But it's also a very convenient kind of proxy or litmus test or ruler for which laws are appropriate for Christians to support and which are not. And laws that have to do with prayer and worship and Bible study and the first 4, government needs to stay out of. Laws that relate to the last 6, I would put it to you that every government on earth has laws that relate to some aspect of each of those last 6, whether it be juvenile delinquency laws. Even if adultery is not outlawed, it's going to impact you in divorce proceedings, and there's laws protecting marriage. Even the very last one, which is hard to sometimes think through, it's laws against, there aren't laws against coveting per se, but when you go to court and you're prosecuted for crimes, your intent is relevant. So actually that becomes a standard of evidence or proof to show that the computer you took out the church, even you say it looked like yours, but we think that you said earlier, I need another computer, and I'm going to take someone. So if we can show that your heart had a covetousness intent, then we can, in fact, convict you under the laws of the land. So this is a very important, it didn't originate with the Adventists. It goes all the way back to the Anabaptists and Calvin and Luther, and the Anabaptists used to argue whether the magistrate had jurisdiction over the whole 10 Commandments or only over the second table. And of course, the Anabaptist, Baptist, and then Adventist tradition said only the second table. The first table is for God alone. So I hope you can see how the pathway that I've led you on, I think, has illustrated some important Adventist prophetic principles. Many people who are maybe more progressive in the church want the church involved in public policy issues and social policy issues and want less said about prophecy. But to my mind, once our prophecy is properly and historically understood and its principles are brought alive today, we can see how those prophetic principles speak directly to the things that are around us. We just have to get past the spiritualization that has happened for the last 50 or 100 years to make these prophecies only about the past or the distant future. Once we see how our pioneers applied these prophetic principles, I'm hopeful of bringing together these prophetic and more traditional strands, because most of our church is quite traditional and they're wedded to these prophecies. But if they could have their eyes opened as to how these prophecies speak to the events that are around us, I believe that we could have a much more active and a much more engaged church in our communities and on our national stage. And I've left about 15 minutes for questions. I can talk a bit more in response to questions about things that you can practically do, that we practically do, what happens at Washington Adventist University, and anything else you want to talk about.
Let's give a round of applause to Professor Miller. We have a few roving mics. I'll start us off, and we'll keep these questions short so that we can try to get as many as possible. But with Ellen and James White being so bold as they were, to this last point you were just talking about, why do you think that so many Adventists today avoid applying prophecy to these political issues? Is it caution, complacency, or cable news? What do you think?
So it's a great question, and there's at least partially a historical answer to this. In the early 20th century, American Christianity was split between the conservative part of Christianity went into a fundamentalist mode, and the more progressive, socially connected types went into a liberal mode. And the fundamentalist mode was very much influenced by perspectives from the southern United States, which believed in a separation of, not only a separation of church and state, but a separation of church, separation of the state from moral critique by the church. Because they had slavery and then discrimination for so many years. And they didn't want churches and religious leaders critiquing this. And so they developed a Christianity that was highly spiritualized, that was about internal piety, and that it was about preparing people for heaven and not mucking it up with talking about social issues around us. And as we became, as Adventists, we felt we had to choose between the liberals on the one hand and the fundamentalists on the other. And when Ellen White died and her moderating, balancing voice was no longer really available, we slid over and became associated with the views and perspectives and approaches of the fundamentalist wing of the church, which said we have to stay out of all politics no matter what. You can't be critiquing slavery and segregation, and that's all politics. And we unfortunately slid into that ditch. So when you talked about 1844 and the cleansing of the sanctuary, it either had something to do with what happened in heaven, or what happened in 1844, or what would happen, eventually when Christ came. Whereas for our pioneers, the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary had to do with the cleansing also of the earthly church, which had to do with the cleansing of the earthly church from social sins. Ellen White said, if you still harbor slave views and you want to be in our church, perhaps you shouldn't be in our church. In fact, if you're here, maybe you should leave, right? She was willing to make a social political view a test of fellowship in ways that we would never think about doing today. So it's about bringing back the pieces of our spiritual identity so that both citizenship in heaven and citizenship in earth are a unified whole rather than two separate things.
Thank you. Next question is here.
Donald Trump said that he wants to destroy the separation of state and church. Do you know what kind of methods he would do that with?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
Donald Trump says he wants to destroy the separation of church and state. Do you know what kind of methods he was going to use?
Oh, that he wants to destroy the separation of church and state? Because he's such a strong Christian? Is that the point that you're making? I mean, look, I think everybody knows that the president has found important political support in certain parts of the evangelical community, and that to retain that support, he wants to give them significant political influence. And, there's been a long-time chant in the evangelical right that the separation of church and state is an alien premise that needs to go away, and they want to undo it. And, to be fair to them, in some ways, the separation of church and state has become a secularist premise that has been used to marginalize religious people, right? We can't overlook the problems that the religious right is complaining about, because there really have been problems, right? And the elites have legislated in certain areas regarding life and marriage and gender that go against what many Americans feel are not just biblical, but natural principles. And so they have a there's a vacuum that the president exploits and wants to go too far in the other direction, right? It's the classic respond to one extreme by going to another extreme. And as Adventists, we believe in religious freedom and moral freedom for all, right? We're not here to launch a crusade against people we disagree with morally. We are looking for a place to protect people of different moral persuasions while we also protect our religious freedom. And we have a long prophetic tradition warning us that the final events in America will involve a version of Christian nationalism. So we shouldn't be surprised at what's happening, but neither should we be applauding it or supporting it, right? I mean, that's the most remarkable response to me, is that after all this prophetic perspective and background that we've had, that some people see this as a good thing somehow, because they are so concerned about the secular, they're so concerned about the king of the South, that they are willing to sort of support and applaud the king of the North. Well, we're given this prophecy to realize there's two wrong extremes. And the most wrong and the most problematic, I mean, I think we're in verse 45, I believe, of Daniel 11, or is it 48, where the king of the North comes and runs over and just overpowers the king of the South. Where is the Democratic Party these days? Where is the resistance at? The field is clear. It's cleared, right? There doesn't seem to be meaningful resistance. It seems to me we're in the last few moments of that description of the takeover of the principles of the King of the North, not only in America, but in many other places around the world.
Hi. As a church, we believe that worshipers, the dignity and the privacy of the worship, the attendees in church. But we also believe as a church that we uphold the law. How would the church react if immigration and naturalization come on grounds? What is our appropriate response?
Well, I don't want to speak against any response any advice you've received from your local conference, but I do know that we have received advice at the North American division level that there are public places in our church where anyone can come, but there are also private places in our church where people can only come with permission. And we are able to request that officials do not come into private places of the church. Now, we're also not supposed to stop them. If we're not going to get in a fight with ICE officials or government officials, but we're told to document, to record with our cameras what's happening and that we haven't given consent. We are a church that believes in the law, but I think, as I stated earlier, we recognize there's two kinds of laws, and it's not just God's man and man's law. There's law malum prohibitum and law malum in se. So I've just dropped some Latin on you, which is worth my legal education, right? But this is an important distinction that not everyone understands, and they should. Malum in se are those laws that are based on fundamental moral principles of right and wrong. So it's always wrong everywhere to kill, murder, and steal, right? Because those laws are based on fundamental moral principles. Malum prohibitum just means it's wrong because people said so. We prohibited it, therefore it's wrong. So those are more laws like zoning laws, laws that regulate, well, traffic laws can be right and wrong to some degree, but licensing your car, perhaps. A variety of laws we have that organize our society that don't have an inherent right and wrong to it. Now, if we should respect all government laws, whichever category they fit into, but when it comes to malum prohibitum, there is greater room for violating those laws in the interest of higher principles. So if you're taking a victim to the hospital who's losing blood, maybe you would be forgiven for exceeding the speed limit, right? Because you are now preserving human life at the expense of a human law. What about immigration laws? Malum in se or malum prohibitum? Well, borders don't exist until human beings say they do, right? There's no like natural line in the ground that you can't pass. Now again, I think we should respect these laws, and I'm an immigrant from England and did my documentation and so on and so forth, but I don't think I should be overly self-righteous and judge someone else who maybe couldn't feed their family, or maybe is being targeted by gangs, or has some very profound reason to preserve human life and health that may come in on an undocumented basis. And lest you become too hastily impious in judging that, think about some of the great refugees, undocumented refugees of history, whether it be Moses or Jesus and the Holy Family, who left and re-entered Israel against at least in leaving, against the specific command of the civil authorities. So we have some pretty strong precedent, including our own prophet, who said unjust laws can be disobeyed, right? But it's in a very narrow area. Adventists are usually law-abiding people, and we should be, but we can become too law-abiding, right? We shouldn't be obeying laws that are unjust or wrong.
Professor Miller, we have time for one more very quick question and maybe a 1 or 2 minute response, and then we'll close the section.
Excuse me. I was here first.
All right, I'll try to give
Sorry,
short
I
answers.
saw him, but go
I'll try
ahead.
to give really short answers.
Go for it.
Thank you. Professor, thank you very much for the insightful information. And also thank you for the information about Ellen G. White encouraged us as a member to participate in a peaceful demonstration, especially with the moral issue. I would love to join that one, but the problem is right now, I'm a U.S. citizen, but I'm not, I wasn't born here. And the second one, I'm not Caucasian. So I will be in trouble if I join the peaceful demonstration. Forget about the peaceful demonstration. When I go somewhere, my children that were born here remind me, take me, so you'll be okay. So, as a church, what can the church do for the minority like us to participate in this kind of situation? Because I am personally eager, to participate, because I've seen and I read so many things that is not right. People are working, and all of a sudden ICE came and then just picked them up without any reason. Thank you.
Well, I think there's safety in numbers, as the pastor was preaching this morning about lead us not into temptation. I think there's ways we us as a group, affirmatively act in our society, and not just the Adventist Church, but I think that there's real room for interfaith action here. And I'm not talking about ecumenism where we all have to come together and believe the same thing. It's where we come together with members of other faith and religious groups to work on specific issues in our society. Ellen White spoke to her largest audiences of her life to non-Adventist groups in speaking on temperance reform and prohibition laws. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to connect with other groups in our society who are seeking to do things. And it shelters us a bit. Like, I'm not a natural-born citizen either. I'm naturalized. I think the courts are not going to distinguish between the two, but the administration might try to make a distinction. Let's have the last question, Daniel, and I'll try to be quick.
Thank you. I've enjoyed your presentation. Apparently, the IRS has issued a notice, memorandum, unshackling churches from political speech and endorsements, etc. If that's true, do you have a read on that latest happening coming out of Washington, D.C.?
Okay, so I have a recommendation for you. There's a group called the Council on Conscience and Justice, which is a consortium of regional conferences, largely African American conferences, that talks to issues like this And last night we had an hour-long panel discussion about this topic, Council on Justice and Conscience, the Johnson Amendment. If you Googled that, you would find it. In just a brief soundbite, we acknowledge that the Johnson Amendment, which prevents churches from endorsing candidates, was not actually aimed at churches to begin with, but applied to all 501c3s, was passed in relation to secular organizations. As a lawyer, I actually believe it violates the free exercise and free religious rights of pastors to say whatever they want about what happens in the community. But, on the other hand, Ellen White says, in language amazingly similar to the Johnson Amendment, that pastors in our churches shouldn't use the pulpit to speak for or against political candidates. And I think that we have to recognize our churches are full of people from both sides of the aisle. And despite my presentation today, that we should be speaking so that both groups can hear us and listen to us, and we don't create disunity and disunion in our churches. I think there are limits to that principle. Ellen White herself endorsed certain candidates when she said, you have a duty, even if the elections are on Sabbath, to go and vote for those who are supporting temperance reform and the outlaw use of sale of alcohol. And I think there are certain principles that can become so against our central principles of religious freedom and justice. Slavery is an example, alcohol use is an example, and I would think that the unlawful locking up and sending to concentration camps our neighbors who happen to be undocumented is a violation of a moral principle sufficient for us to talk about.
Yes, thank you so much.
I'm Pastor Tara Van Cross, and we're so glad that you're here as a part of this Azure Hills Church community. Please like and subscribe, and click the bell to be notified for when we share new videos. Would you also pray over giving to support this ministry? AzureHills.org/give is the place to go. We pray for you regularly, that God would continue to move and work in your life.